In 2016, the University of Canberra hospital was in the early stages of construction. Multiplex Constructions Pty Ltd was the principal contractor for the construction. For work health and safety purposes, it conducted the business or undertaking at the construction site and had primary responsibility under the WHS Act. Multiplex contracted with RAR for the provision of mobile crane services at the construction site. RAR was also an entity conducting a business or undertaking with primary responsibility under the WHS Act. The crane that was involved in the offence was a 2016 TEDx Mac 25 non-slewing pick and carry crane. It was the only such crane owned by RAR. It operated differently from other similar type of cranes. The lifting capacity of the crane was determined by the operator, who had to consider the boom length, radius, and articulation required for a lift. Usually the operator's decision would be guided by the load mover indicator (LMI) system on the crane. The LMI system on the crane was important because it calculated the crane's carrying capacity from moment to moment, taking account of the many variables that influenced carrying capacity. The LMI system provided the crane operator with real-time dashboard information, including load/overload, percentage of rated capacity, load radius, boom angle, boom length, and additional lifting capacity. The display showed the crane's rated capacity, that is, the maximum load that the crane could safely carry based on its current configurations. The LMI system also showed the terrain and the forward and side tilt of the crane. However, the display only showed the percentage of rated capacity up to 110%. If the load exceeded 110% of rated capacity, the display continued to show 110%. Once the LMI system showed that the crane was overloaded for its configurations, a cutout was immediately activated, as were visual and audible alarms, operating internally and externally. To increase the overloaded state of the crane, the operator had to manually override the safety function. The crane could operate in superlift mode or 301 mode. This mode increased the crane's lifting capacity from 10 tons to as much as 25 tons, depending on the crane's configurations at the relevant time. For the crane to operate in superlift mode, the operator had to install a second counterweight at the rear of the crane. The counterweight needed to face a particular direction so that the crane's sensors would register that the counterweight had been fitted, and the LMI system would assess the crane's load capacity by reference to the superlift mode. Within the crane's cabin, there was an operator manual and lifting chart showing the crane's lifting capacity in various modes, including the superlift mode. The operator manual clearly stated that the operator should not operate the crane until they had read and understood the manual. The manual explained the safety system, stating that all safety messages should be obeyed to avoid possible injury or death. At the construction site, there was a generator with a marked gross weight of 10.3 tons. It was to be used by Multiplex to provide temporary power. It was fitted with lifting points and pull plates. Now, the events prior to 4th of August 2016. Matthew Holt, an RAR employee, operated the crane to perform lifts at the construction site on 2 occasions. Before operating the crane on the construction site, Mr. Holt received the mandatory site induction. On 7 June 2016, he used the crane to move the generator from the front gate of the site. On 18 July 2016, he used the crane to move the generator to a new position. Mr. Holt told RAR that he did not believe that it was safe to use the crane to move the generator. This information was not conveyed to the offender. Had the offender been provided with this information, he would have refused to use the crane to undertake the lift. The agreed statement of the facts indicated that RAR should have conveyed Mr. Holt's opinion to the offender. And on 2nd and 4th of August 2016, Mr. Holt was on holiday. On 2nd August 2016, the offender was directed to work as the driver/operator of the crane. Mr. Paul Kelly was assigned as his dogman. The offender performed one job with the crane but did not use the superlift mode. Mr. Holt, excuse me if I'm not saying it right, Mr. Holt had been given training in how to use the crane, including how to operate the crane in superlift mode. However, RAR did not provide the offender with information, training, or instruction about how to safely operate the crane, how to use the superlift mode, or how to fit the associated counterweight. He was provided with general induction information. Several weeks before 4th of August 2016, Multiplex decided that the generator should be moved to a new position, about 50 meters away from where it could provide temporary power to the tower crane. On 4th of August 2016, Multiplex decided that the generator should be moved to its new position as the tower crane was to be used the following day. There was some urgency about repositioning the generator. Between 2 and 2:30 p.m., Multiplex directed RAR to move the generator that day. Multiplex managers and RAR representative inspected the site to determine how it would be moved. RAR proposed using a 200-ton slewing crane or a tilt tray truck. Multiplex rejected the proposal as the cost and logistics of using that equipment were not something that the Multiplex was, quote-unquote, eager to be part of. The offender did not participate in this discussion and was not told about it. RAR and Multiplex walked the travel route and concluded that the crane would be suitable for the job. Neither Multiplex nor RAR undertook the requisite risk assessment concerning the means and route by which the generator would be moved. That day, commencing at 6:35 a.m., the offender and Mr. Kelly completed 4 jobs using the crane, all of which were conducted within the safety limits of the crane. None involved using the superlift mode. Mr. Kelly and the offender were then told by Mr. Newton of RAR that there was a further job to be done. At about 4 p.m., they returned to the RAR yard and were told by Mr. Newton that they were to use the crane to move a generator for Multiplex, and that the job had to be completed that very same day, so that the tower crane could be used the following morning. Mr. Newton conveyed the impression of the job was important to RAR. RAR directed the offender and Mr. Kelly to take the superlift counterweight and de-shackles. At about 4:52 p.m., the offender and Mr. Kelly arrived at the construction site. The offender drove the crane. Mr. Kelly drove a small truck containing the superlift counterweight. When they arrived, they were met by 4 Multiplex employees: Andrew Drummond, Senior Site Supervisor; Monroe Jones, Health and Safety Representative for the Site Work Group; Herman Holtz, Tower Crane Operator; and Timothy Brown, Tower Crane Dogman. Mr. Drummond was advised that as the offender had not previously attended the construction site, he required the mandatory site safety induction. The offender himself requested a site induction. However, none was undertaken. All present agreed that the de-shackles were inappropriate as they were too heavy and did not fit the lifting points. The offender told Mr. Drummond that RAR had a 200-ton slewing crane which would be more appropriate for the job, the same suggestion that had been made earlier in the day by another RAR employee, but was told that it was not an option, and the crane had to be used for the job and was suitable, having previously been used to move the generator. As stated above, at no stage was the offender told that Mr. Holt had expressed a different view regarding the suitability of the crane. Had he known of Mr. Holt's view, it would have been decisive in persuading him that he should not proceed with the lift. As the offender was concerned about doing the job and felt that Multiplex was pressuring him to proceed, he called Mr. Newton for the purpose of seeking guidance, but Mr. Newton did not answer the telephone. The offender felt compelled to proceed because both RAR and Multiplex wanted the job done and he was worried about his job security. However, after discussing the matter with Mr. Kelly and Multiplex workers, the offender felt more comfortable with the job. Those present agreed that the lift would be a difficult one, but it could be done. The offender knew that the generator weighed about 10 tons. It was 10.3 tons and that the crane had a lifting capacity of 10 tons. In addition to the weight of the generator, the weight of the lifting equipment was about 1.2 tons, bringing the total weight to 11.5 tons. The offender knew that the crane's lifting capacity would be increased if the superlift counterweight was fitted. If so, it would operate in the 301 mode rather than the basic 201 mode. The offender was told that he could not move the generator by the shortest route, a straight line distance of about 50 meters, because of in-ground plumbing. The travel distance would be about 600 meters. The offender considered that the only way in which the generator could be moved was picking it up with the boom extended and then bringing it close to the crane. All present agreed with this course. Due to the associated configuration of the crane, the load at the commencement of the lift would exceed the safe lifting capacity of the crane, as described in the lifting chart for the 301 mode. Had the offender checked the lifting chart for the 301 mode, he would have realized that the load exceeded the available lifting capacity. Given the necessary configuration of the crane at the commencement of the lift, Prior to the commencing the lift, the offender should have undertaken a risk assessment of the lift, but he did not do so because the light was fading and the generator needed to be moved that day. A risk assessment would have involved during the unladen crane along the travel path to assess the terrain and any risk along the path, including the slope of the path, which at one point involved an unavoidable slope of 6.59 degrees and other terrain angles of up to 10.27 degrees. The manufacturer warning stated that the crane must not operate on a slope greater than 5 degrees. The offender and Mr. Kelly connected the counterweights to the crane. However, the superlift counterweight was fitted in the incorrect direction, vis-a-vis the crane. This meant that its sensor could not be detected by the crane's computer, and the computer would make calculation as though the counterlift was not fitted. It would not recognize that the crane could operate in 301 mode, and the figures shown on the LMI display for overload and rated capacity of the crane would be inaccurate. Neither the offender nor Mr. Kelly knew that these problems would flow if the counterweight was fitted incorrectly. Although the process for fitting the counterweight was described in the operator's manual, the offender looked at the manual but did not locate the relevant section. Once the offender realized that the crane's computer was not recognizing superlift counterweight and the 301 mode, he tried to call Mr. Newton at RAR, but again his call went unanswered. The offender then rechecked the load charts in the crane's cabin and decided that the crane could readily perform the lift. The offender believed that the computer was not recognizing the superlift mode because of a computer malfunction. He informed several people, including Mr. Kelly and the deceased, that the crane thought it was in 201 mode, but that it was in fact in 301 mode. The offender, Mr. Kelly, Mr. Holtz, and Mr. Brown rigged the generator using the dragging lugs of the generator rather than the lifting points. I'm going to repeat this sentence because it is very critical in what's about to happen. The offender, Mr. Kelly, Mr. Holtz, and Mr. Brown rigged the generator using the dragging lugs of the generator rather than the lifting points. This meant that the load was not rigged in a way that minimized the load height. The height and the length of the boom were greater than was required to lift the load. Further, the chains were longer than necessary because they were attached to the dragging lugs rather than the lifting points of the generator, changing the generator's center of gravity and including a tilt of 6.61 degrees. The safer lifting configuration would have reduced the swing of the load and total slung load height. At about 5:53 p.m., the lifting operation commenced. Initially, the offender had to extend the boom of the crane to pick up the generator. He knew that the crane may be overloaded, but the overloading would cease once the boom was brought in. This was the first occasion that the crane operated in excess of its rated capacity. The crane alarm sounded several times and the computer indicated that the crane was overloaded. However, the offenders surmised correctly that the computer system was displaying incorrect information as it had not registered the superlift counterweight. Consequently, he overrode the safety mechanism when the alarm sounded. For approximately 5 minutes after commencing the lift, the offenders operated the crane with the safety alarms operating because the LMI system did not register that the superlift counterweight was fitted. In fact, the crane was not overloaded. At one stage in the first 5 minutes, the offender reversed the crane up a slope that its steepest was 9.22 degrees. The offender carried the load as low as he thought that the conditions allowed. However, between 5:59 and 6:01 p.m., the load was carried at an excessive height. Contrary to the safety recommendations of the manufacturer and the Crane Industry Council of Australia, the offender operated the crane while the base of the generator was more than 2 meters above the ground. Excuse me. Despite the poor visibility, the offender continued with the lift. The route south sloped towards from right to left. At the base of the slope, there was a body of standing water. The left wheels of the crane were on the edge of the water, on soft ground of uncertain surface stability. The internal and external visual and audible alarms were activated because of the side slope. Between 6:10 p.m. and 6:11 p.m., the offender drove the crane at a side tilt of more than 5 degrees for 1 minute and 29 seconds with a tilt of 10 degrees at 6:10 p.m. and 50 seconds. The offender made a right turn and continued forward in a westerly direction to an area where the track narrowed and there were dirt piles on either side. Mr. Brown was walking in front of the crane, steadying the load by hand as the load swung. He heard the offender comment that the back wheels were coming off the ground and saw for himself that the back wheels were indeed coming off the ground. The offender continued to drive the crane before stopping and then reversing up an incline on a track that ran north-south. As the offender reversed the crane, Mr. Kelly, Mr. Jones, Mr. Brown, and Mr. Holtz were positioned at each corner of the generator to assist by manually stabilizing it. A controlled lift, such as this is a recognized practice in the construction industry. At this point, the higher end of the generator was almost 1.8 meters above the ground. At about 6:21 p.m., the crane approached a narrow section of the path. The offender stopped and reconfigured the crane so that it would fit. He lowered and telescoped out the boom, then rotated the generator to carry it lengthways, parallel with the crane. The lowering of the boom increased the radius from 2.87 meters to 4.44 meters, overloading the crane so that it was operating at 102.2% of its rated capacity. The alarms were operating, but the offender repeatedly overrode the safety system. This was the second occasion on which the crane operated in excess of its rated capacity. The offender drove up the slight incline of the rough and uneven path. At approximately 6:24 p.m., the offender repositioned the loads so that the generator was across the front of the crane. He continued to reverse up a slight incline and commenced a U-turn. As he was turning, the right wheels of the crane hit a dirt mount on the edge of the travel path, causing the crane to tilt to its left at 10.10 degrees for about 1 minute. Again, the alarms were activated. From this tilt, the offender drove the crane forward towards its destination. At about 6:38 p.m., the offender maneuvered the crane by lowering and extended the boom. He used the override function for 13 seconds while the boom was extended to the point where the crane was overloaded to 104.6% of its rated capacity. The offender again extended the boom to rotate the generator. The boom was extended from 8.55 meters to 9.81 meters. And articulation was increased from 11.3 degrees to 30.5 degrees. Because the heavier end of the generator was further from the crane and load were destabilized. At this stage, the higher end of the generator base was over 2 meters from the ground. At 6:41 p.m., the offender operated the crane at 130.5% of its rated capacity. The crane tipped to its right while carrying the generator. As it tipped, the gravitational force of the generator pulled the crane from tip of the boom, accelerating the boom as it fell to the ground, where 4 persons were in the immediate vicinity. The tip of the boom impacted Mr. Holtz, crushing him between boom and the ground and killing him instantly. The criminal proceedings began on 18th April 2018 with information laid in respect of Mr. Watts, Multiplex, RAR Cranes, and number of other defendants. Those other defendants included the dogman who was assisting the crane driver at the time of the accident, as well as the site's supervisor and safety officers, both of whom were employed by Multiplex. Multiplex Constructions Chief Executive Officer and RAR Cranes Managing Director were also charged, as was the site manager on the day, who was also employed by Multiplex. The matters first came before the court, that's a coroner's court, on 17th May 2018. Mr. Watts. The proceeding involving Mr. Watts were eventually committed to the Supreme Court for trial on 28th February 2019, the offences including the offence of manslaughter. It is noted that Mr. Watts has since passed away. On 14th October 2021, Multiplex pleaded guilty to a charge of failing to comply with a health and safety duty, a Category 2 offence, pursuant to Section 32 of the WHS Act. The maximum penalty for a body corporate was a fine of $1.5 million. Multiplex was convicted and fined $150,000. On 14th October 2021, RAR Cranes pleaded guilty to the same offence of failing to comply with a health and safety duty. Pursuant to Section 32 of the WHS Act, RAR Cranes was convicted and fined $300,000. The use of cranes on construction site is acknowledged to be a high-risk activity, and crane accidents contribute significantly to the rate of construction site deaths around Australia at rates greater than other mobile plants. The safety issues around Mr. Holtz's death. These general outcomes in the construction industry reflect the specific safety culture failings that were apparent in respect of Mr. Holtz's death. Mr. Holtz's family have raised concern with the court about how the prosecution process unfolded. Number one, because of lack of information. The family expressed the view that insufficient information was given to them about the prosecution process. Number two, the dropping of cases and charges, the changing of charges. The family feel that a number of people originally charged and the charges that they initially faced better reflected issues of culpability in respect of Mr. Holtz's death. They strongly disagree with the downgrading of charges and the dropping of cases in respect of some of the people originally charged. Inability to read victim impact statements. Number three, in the proceeding involved Multiplex, the family complained that they were not allowed to read their victim impact statement. Number four, leaving Mr. Holtz's body in situ for too long. The family felt that their loved one's body was left under the crane for too long and should have been removed earlier by the investigation. And number fifth is the delay. The family could not understand why the criminal proceedings took so long. The family feel that in respect of Mr. Holtz's death, justice has not been done. Mr. Holtz's body remained under the crane until 30 minutes past midnight on 5th of August 2016. Now this is the coroner saying, I fully understand and acknowledge that distress that reality has caused the family. In fact, that Mr. Holtz had died instantly of injuries was quickly assessed. The worksite and the overturned crane had to be made safe on the advice of suitably qualified people. A crime scene had to be established and investigators with relevant expertise had to be identified and brought to the site. Once there, they were tasked with the capturing details about the circumstances of Mr. Holtz's death, including measurement and photography. A forensic medical officer was not able to exercise safe access to the body for some time. She did attend at 11:47. Machinery had to be organized to allow the crane to be moved off Mr. Holtz without further desecrating his body. Mr. Holtz's body remained draped throughout the investigation. The investigation of death is complex and must be undertaken with care. Here, and as always, a balance must be struck between the dictates of coronial, as in coroners, and likely criminal investigation, issues of safety, and the need to ensure that the body of the deceased is treated with respect and dignity. I, as in coroner, is addressing, saying that I am satisfied that occurred here. And then there's delay that is being addressed, and then there's recommendation. Now I, as in the coroner, recommended the government consult with the court and other stakeholders with a view to reviewing the operations of Section 58 and 58A of the Act. The Victorian Coroners Act 2008, for example, has a much simpler model that vests a great deal of discretion in a coroner to not hold hearings, inquests in cases that may involve related criminal proceeding. And then there's provisional findings in sections 55 of the Act, and then there's condolences, which the coroner is offering to the loved ones of the deceased of the victim. Reads something like this: Mr. Holtz and his wife, Rangi Mary Nellie Holtz, forgive me if I didn't say that right, met when she was 15 years old and he was 17 years old. Their 42-year marriage was filled with happy times, spent with family and friends, enjoying birthdays, holidays, weddings, family gatherings, and trips together. Mr. Holtz was a hard-working man who was deeply committed to caring for his family. Mr. Holtz described him as a beautiful husband, a wonderful father to their children, and the greatest grandfather to their grandchildren. To his family, Mr. Holtz was a loving, strong, and reliable figure in their lives, and his death is still profoundly felt by those who knew and loved him. He did not deserve to die in that way he did. The victim impact statements that were received by the court in the Watts proceedings attest to the family's grief and the tragic emotional dislocation that has been caused by his senseless death. And then the coroner expresses his or her condolences to the Holtz family. My final thoughts are with the loved ones of the deceased. And the last paragraph here is that delay in the disposition of a coronial inquest can add significantly to the trauma experienced by the surviving family and on behalf of the coroner's court. And the last sentence is that an apology is made to Mr. Holtz's family for the delay they have experienced and the trauma that delay has caused.